In this episode, we're going to talk about application. With so many things being new and so many things being said on the channel, I thought it was necessary to kind of put this in perspective in how we are to put this into use, an application, if you will. This is very difficult because the idea behind the channel is to really correct some of the ideas that have been put forth in earlier times. So what this episode is going to try to do is try to show you how we got to this point. And then as you see how we got to this point, then it becomes possible to see whether or not we should change some things, or we need to leave things the way they are, we need to improve on things, or we should decide to do some things a little bit different. So the first part of the presentation today is going to be a history of the original model of biblical ideas. The second part is going to be a history of the changes from that original model to what we have today, the modern model, the modern Western model. Now, originally, the model for biblical ideas fundamentally is Egypt's divine sacred model. That's what I'm calling it, because it needs to be understood on a foundational level first, and then we talk about some of the ideas that it embraces. The religious ideas of ancient Egypt were not always correct, but many of the fundamental ideas, many of the bottom line of many of the customs and theories or theologies that we have come from this foundational civilization. As I have tried to say in other episodes, there is a huge problem with the English language. Chuna Achebe tried to illustrate that many of the African ideas are not supported in English many times. And so it becomes very difficult to understand some of the concepts that's being portrayed, especially concepts that were thought of and practiced many thousands of years ago in a culture that has now disappeared. So let's take some examples of this. Theology. Well, that word doesn't really fit, yet it's the word we use in what we in how we present God. Theology, from the Greek theos, meaning God, and the suffix ology, meaning the study of God. Where Africans would say, no, you can't study God. Because you can't study God, the word in and of itself is not really appropriate. The word philosophy, well, Western philosophy tends to articulate itself without God. They try to explain everything on a human basis without God. That doesn't work with African ideas either. So as we have demonstrated in the other episodes, the word gods doesn't really evoke the concepts that it's trying to portray. Another word that we haven't talked about so far is ancestor worship. Well, there is no such thing. No such thing as ancestor worship, at least not in the way we use that term. So we have to go back and we have to try and articulate some of this original model. What we tend to what we tend to talk about is Moses, and that's the focus of the channel. Moses and the Torah is our prototype for trying to understand the concepts that the Bible talks about. But Moses himself is not the end all for this. We see that Moses came out of Egypt and that he lived in Egypt, but that doesn't mean that throughout the rest of the Old Testament, Egypt was very, very influential. So even though Moses writes the law, and even though Egypt is a great influence, it doesn't stop with Moses. For example, You have under Hezekiah, you have, as you're seeing this picture here, is a picture of Hezekiah's national seal. This is the king's seal. And in the center, you see the actual seal itself. And then to the right, you can see a drawing of it. And to the left, you can see the Egyptian scarab beetle. On Hezekiah's signet and seal is the Egyptian principle Khepra. So here we see that Egypt is still being influential in Israel. Something that may come as a surprise to most is that we have found an Egyptian temple that stood in Jerusalem. There's an abundance of evidence to support this, and you are looking at many of the artifacts from this temple. It seems to have been dedicated in honor of a principle of God. You can see there are pillars, which are Egyptian pillars, and you can see some of the pottery and a few other of the artifacts. All of this was an Egyptian temple that stood in Jerusalem, and it seems to have stood from the time of the judges. This is to say that Egypt was a great influence in Israel all through the Old Testament. But this doesn't describe all of it. Egypt influenced so many people, whether it be the Hyksos or the Canaanites, the Nubians, the Assyrians, Greece, Rome, and of course the Hebrews themselves. Egypt had a tremendous influence on many people. Now, here is where the world changed. Alexander the Great crossed the Mediterranean Sea and conquered the then known world. Now, this is important because not only did Alexander bring his armies, not only did he bring the people, he also brought his ideas of his civilization, and they imposed these ideas onto the rest of the world. Hellenism, which is the system of ideas that Alexander brought, is the change that takes place in civilization. It rewrites the entire civilization of the ancient world. So Alexander begins a very, very different set of ideas around 323 BC. Alexander's ideas, I shouldn't say just him alone, but his civilization, brings to the world very, very new ideas. Then those ideas continue under Rome. Rome doesn't change a whole lot. It actually adopts many of the ideas of Alexander. So the Greek culture is a continuation in Roman culture. Now, under the Greek culture, you have a very specific and very important event. When Alexander takes control of Egypt, he builds his capital in Egypt, and he makes his capital there, and he calls the city Alexandria. But then he does something very important. He builds a library, and then he goes all over Egypt, and he takes the documents out of the Egyptian temples, and he brings all the documents into one location called the Library of Alexandria. We estimate that there were 400,000 scrolls. We've never been able to accurately identify exactly how many there were, but the consensus among most scholars is that it was about 400,000 scrolls. This library was the accumulation of the knowledge of the then known world. Most of that were Egyptian documents. Then, under the Romans, under Julius Caesar, that library was destroyed. Many of the documents, many of the wisdom, the principles, ideas, were all burned in this great fire. We're still not sure how it started, but it happened around 48 BC under Julius Caesar. The Greek ideas were different. They were very different, and they were very, very alien to the ancient world. They were new. They came from across the Mediterranean, and they presented very, very new ideas indeed. I've listed a few of them here so you could see them. How they thought about monotheism, how they thought about philosophy. Even truth itself was a different concept for the Greeks. Everybody knows what writing is, right? And if we look in the Bible, we say things like this. Well, this is poetry. This is a metaphor. This is an allegory. This is symbolism. These are all Greek ideas. However, the ancients, meaning the Egyptians, did not think like that. Their ideas of writing has a very, very different function. Therefore, biblical ideas have different ideas. The biblical ideas, that understanding is more akin to Egyptian ideas, not Greek. But what we have done in Christianity is that we have taken Greek ideas and tried to apply those ideas to the text. And that can be problematic. Mathematics, the Greeks had their ideas of mathematics, but their ideas of mathematics were very primitive, so they learned a lot from the ancient Egyptians. Now, with Greece and Rome imposing their alien ideas, their beliefs, their ideals, the way they understood things, the way they understood the world that they live in, even though that's alien to the ancient world, it's alien to Hebrew culture, it's alien to African culture, alien to Egyptian culture, we have insisted on applying these ideas to the biblical text. Under Rome, we have the rise of Christianity. Now, when Christianity comes about, you have the Romans in control of the world and thus in control of the biblical text. Rome has a monopoly on the biblical text. And so we have created a model of how to approach the Bible from the ideas of the Romans and the Greeks. We enter the Middle Ages and we start to see some of the ideas that comes from the ideas of Rome and Greece. However, when this started to happen, one of the early church fathers saw it changing. And this is what he had to say. Tertullian makes this famous statement. He says, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" What he is trying to say is that, why are you using Greek ideas to interpret Hebrew principles? This statement that Tertullian makes, I think, is a very key issue, a very key statement to get us to understand that what's being done to the biblical text is being imposed by alien ideas. And this channel attempts to say, we also need to look back at the original model and then interpret it. We don't have to throw out the entire Greek and Roman ideas, but we do need to bring back an understanding of the original model for which the Bible was conceptualized. We come through the Middle Ages and you have many theologians sitting down, writing principles and ideas and coming up with different interpretations and things like that. And all this is going on. Now, this is important. Let me take a side note here, okay? During the time that Christianity is in its early stages, and during the time that theologians are making their ideas and interpretations of these fundamental principles that will become a part of Christianity, and we will inherit it to our modern times, while that's being developed, the Egyptian hieroglyphs could not be read. Well, this is a real problem. How can you make interpretation to the biblical text without the civilization that gave it the most influence, at least in the Old Testament? But yet that was done. we come all the way down to the 16th century to a man by the name of Martin Luther. Now, let's be clear here. Martin Luther may have made the break from the Catholic Church, but he still continues in the same paradigm of these Greek and Roman ideas for applying it to the text. So, in spite of the fact that he breaks, many of the fundamental ideas that Luther has is still the same. And from Martin Luther, we have so many denominations. All of the denominations that followed in the Protestant Reformation are coming into this paradigm. So think about some of the denominations you know of today. The founders of those denominations are walking into the same paradigm. Not that it's wrong, not that it's an error, but it's a certain perspective on the biblical text itself, and that needs to be considered. So, Joseph Smith, who starts the Church of Latter-day Saints, he is operating within that paradigm. You can think of any church fathers that you can think of, and they are part of that same paradigm. Once again, that doesn't mean they're right, wrong. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the actual model that's being used to interpret the text. Now, during this medieval time before Luther, you have a lot of ideas that's being portrayed, ideas that's being proposed, ideas that are actually developed during that time. On your screen are a list of some of the men. Never heard about them. Most of us have never heard about these names, but yet these are the men who actually established the paradigm that we have in Christianity today. Warburton, he's one of the most influential. He talks about pantheism. He fights against that, trying to define the problems with pantheism. Hobbes, John Potter is a very, very important figure, because Potter tries to argue that the Greek paradigm, the Greek institutions are superior to everybody. This makes it very problematic for understanding the Hebrew culture. Immanuel Kant is a very important figure because he actually defines what we understand today as human. So, how we see ourselves when we approach the biblical text is going to be something very important. Now, notice, this doesn't have a whole lot to do with doctrines, what you believe about your denominations, but actually you as an individual. What are you? Human. It is Immanuel Kant who defines this, and he defines this in favor and understanding of what the Greeks thought. Here's a bright light. Here's a bright light. In the 17th century, a group of theologians made an attempt to go backwards and try to embrace this original model. It's called salvation history. At the bottom of your screen, you can see the German term that's used for it. It's called sacred history. It's called salvation history. It's something completely not talked about these days. The sacred history tries to get at that original model, and that original model is that facts are not important here. What's most important is what has been revealed. So, sacred history does not bind itself to what is fact and what is not fact. What is only important is what faith reveals about God. However, this school of thought does not survive because we, chasing after the Greek paradigm, decide that we believe in the facts, the historical perspective, all these kinds of things. Those things are the most important. So that school of thought, sacred history or salvation history, kind of falls into history. No matter, the Christian church continues to develop. By the time we come to the 19th century, you have a lot of denominations forming. You have a lot of forming, okay? Then in the 20th century, hey, this is what we do. In the 20th century, a man by the name of Hans Fry decides to sit down and tell exactly how we developed our methods of interpretation. As near as I can tell, there are no less than 17 different systems of biblical interpretation, and all denominations believe they have the right one. Yet and still, Hans Fry, in his book, The Eclipse of the Biblical Narrative, tries to outline the actual way that these systems of methods of interpretation has developed. And they have not developed from the original model, the original Hebrew model, but from a Greek and Roman model. Then we come to the famed Age of Enlightenment. There's a problem here. There's a real problem. The Age of Enlightenment, around 1685, is a revolution. Now let me boil it down to its most basic ideas. The Age of Enlightenment is a revolution in which they switched from the European Christian ideas and they went back to the pagan Greek ideals. Let me say what that kind of is. The church during the Middle Ages did some bad things. And because they did some bad things, the leaders of Western society came together and said, you know what? We can't trust the church. The Christian church is not going to be a good basis for us to build our societies. We need a new model. We can't use the Christian models because the people in the Christian church are corrupt, A, B, and C. So what they decided to do is they needed a model. So even though the Christian model had been the model for the Middle Ages, they decided to break with that tradition and go back to the original model of the pagan Greeks. And so they install Greek ideals again, even though they really never left it, but they put that forward to be their prototype so that they could build their societies, and that included biblical interpretation. I know nobody wants to really talk about this part, but we're going to have to. Embedded in biblical interpretation was a concept, a theory, a theology, a belief called the curse of Ham. The curse of Ham had a tremendous effect on biblical interpretation because it was understood even at that time that African people were involved. Egypt was kind of a contradiction because the whole idea was that African people were cursed, but Egypt shined brightly, and that shine says it defied being cursed. There are few civilizations on earth that have soared and have prospered as much as ancient Egypt. Greece only lasted about 500 years, Rome about 500 years, somewhere in that neighborhood, and that's about it. Egypt lasted 3,200 years, the longest lasting civilization to ever exist on our planet. So this did not really fit with the curse of Ham. So therefore there needed to be an explanation for that. Now remember, the curse of Ham was developed to justify slavery, and this was part of the contradiction. So we are faced with this. We are faced with two paradigms: the original model, which I have called the sacred model, or the Hellenistic model. One way or another, you're going to have to choose between the two models. There is no other model outside of this. And if you decide that you want to explore what we can learn from the ancient model, that would be a good journey. Now, we already are established in the Hellenistic model. That is the model we use in modernity, because this is Western civilization and the United States is part of Western culture. and Western culture has its own agenda. Two men, and I'm only mentioning two, it hasn't been only two, made a challenge. George James and Martin Banal. They made a claim. They made the claim that Greek philosophy, the Greek paradigm, the Hellenistic paradigm, was stolen. Not borrowed, but stolen. When the Library of Alexander was established, what they said was that the Greek philosophers went into those libraries, took the information, copied it, and then passed it off as their own. That's the claim. Now that I'm making it simple, but that's the basic idea. Martin Banal's book, Black Athena, and George James' book, who's a little more pointed, called it Stolen Legacy. Each of these books made very compelling cases on their thesis. Now, while all these things are going on, the Enlightenment and all of the medieval practices, Egyptian hieroglyphs could not be read. Then in 1822, 19th century, 1822, Jean Champollion cracks the Rosetta Stone. He deciphers Egyptian hieroglyphs. And he starts to read, and scholars start to read Egyptian texts. And you know what? A lot of the things that the Christian scholars had developed through the Middle Ages and stuff like that, we find out that, hey, some of the things were not as accurate as they could have been. But it's too late. People already believed in this Greek paradigm. But Egyptian texts were there. People could read them. Scholars could see them. And now we could look at the Bible and make refinements or change things or understand things better and things like that. But that's going to be tough. It's going to be difficult. In the 19th century, we have another new science coming on called archaeology. Archaeology presents us with a very interesting aspect of understanding biblical interpretation. Archaeology says, hey, we don't care what you believe, we're not interested in your faith, we're not those kinds of things. No, all we're going to show you is what the evidence is. Then, once you see the evidence, then you choose for yourself how you want to believe. But our job is to show you the facts. The man who started this discipline, Sir Flinders Petrie, he was racist, and by any standards, even the standards of his day, he was considered very, very biased. With all of these challenges in front of us, what do we do? Well, some people might be tempted to say something like this. They might say, well, since the Bible is not true, it's fake, it's not, it's folklore, and then it was stolen. There are all sorts of ideas that we can present simply by learning this new information. No, that's like saying, in my car, I have a bad transmission, so I'm going to throw away the whole car. No, you don't throw away the whole car. You replace the transmission. Well, it's going to be very expensive. Yes, it's going to be very expensive, but considering the value of the car, you need to keep the car and replace the transmission. Just because there have been mistakes made within the paradigms throughout our understanding of biblical interpretation doesn't mean you throw the baby out with the bathwater. We come back, we repair, we improve, and we go forward.